So in the years leading up to the uprising, my father would take me to visit his friend's liquor store in South LA. As a kid, I didn't really understand the negative impacts of those kinds of businesses to the community. I just understood that my father's friend, who was trained as an engineer in Korea, was toiling away behind those crowded counters, trying to eke out a living for his family. One of those times that we visited, I remember we saw a heated shouting match between my father's friend and one of the customers. It wasn't until years later that I realized that those two men shouting at each other actually had a lot in common. Of course, one was a Korean business owner who made money in that community and could go home to a nice suburb at night. And the other one was an African-American customer that actually lived in one of the most violence-ridden, impoverished communities in the country. But at that moment, at that particular time, those two men had sort of a common injustice, that the society that they lived in really couldn't fully appreciate who they were and allow them to live up to their full potential. And they had no real power to change the systems or the structures that caused this. All they could do is really just yell at each other. You know, I began to realize that that equation between the injustice for the Korean community and the injustice for the Black community can't be resolved without thinking about the overall structures in our society. That when those systems are set up to only lift up certain people and to keep only certain people in power, the rest of these communities, the rest of our communities are really there left to fight for the crumbs, and really they're pitted against one another. And so 20 years later, I'm actually really excited about where we are, to think about how many communities have built over these past 20 years a stronger voice and more power. How we've seen a sea change in the number of elected officials and decision makers that actually come from some of those marginalized communities. But there really still is a lot more that we need to do. There are still some communities that are so below the radar that you can't recognize them as being a part of our country, let alone our city. There are still too many systems and policies that need dramatic reform. And there's still too many communities just shouting at one another because they don't really have a strong enough voice in the halls of power.